By a show of hands, how many people have used AI? How many people have used AI for more than 6 months? Fewer. How many have used it for more than a year? Like 2. I think that's what's really interesting. You know, we like Amy said, we are in some very unprecedented times, which I think makes your jobs all that more important. You know, I think the other insight that Amy had was we are in a land of margins. And so if you think about AI, is that going to be the thing that's the next big thing, or is it already the big thing? And I think that can have a tremendous amount of impact on those margins. I wanted to introduce Ryan Heath. If you guys haven't read his newsletter, an Axio, the AI newsletter daily, it's fantastic, super, super interesting. Really recommend that you check it out. We also want to reintroduce Alex Worth, who is the CEO of Quorum, who you heard from a little bit earlier. As many of you know, Quorum is a leader in our space and is really pioneering AI for public affairs professionals. And so I think we'll talk a little bit about that today and also get into it. So with that, I'll turn it over to you all.
Great. Well, good afternoon and great to see everyone for a second time. We've got a very timely and relevant conversation about AI here with Ryan Heath, who, as Aaron mentioned, is the co-author of the daily Axios AI Plus newsletter. But also, super interestingly, is Ryan's now based in the US after 10 years or so in Brussels. He wrote the Politico Brussels playbook, their equivalent of the US playbook, every day, that put him right in the center of all of the media and reporting that happened in Brussels. And also had the chance to moderate the 2019 EU Commission election debate, a pretty cool opportunity. And was a former presidential speechwriter and staffer for the European Commission. And so just brings an incredible perspective to this conversation on AI, realizing that it really does have global impacts and the regulation is happening globally. So Ryan, we're thrilled to have you here today. And as I mentioned, President Biden is literally speaking in about 20 minutes about his executive order on AI. So I also shared with Ryan as we were preparing, thank you for being here and not at the White House covering that. But today is really momentous in that the administration has released their guidance and overview on that executive order, which we'll cover and talk about what it means for the organizations in this room. But I want to start with the real basic question, just to set the playing field. What is AI, and how would you define it to both the policy audience and then maybe to individuals out there?
The sad but honest answer is that it's a matter of debate. So even experts don't agree on what is and isn't artificial intelligence. So I think the first thing to know is that it's a set of technologies and it's an umbrella term. It's not one sort of black and white thing. And then within that, I think it's better to think about it as coded intelligence. You know, it's not artificial because it is real, and it's coded because it really depends upon humans at this point. You know, one day the AI might be good enough that it can just learn on its own and instruct us or control us. I personally don't think that's going to happen. But what it refers to now is a series of machine learning processes. Sometimes it's called deep learning. And the other term that is now much more commonly referred to is natural language processing, which is what is behind ChatGPT and those other services that have come out this year. And so the point there is that it's really about machines that are spotting patterns and then being able to act upon what they see in those patterns. And for the time being, it relies upon us telling them how to do it and to exist within a particular framework. And at some point in the future, the machines will have the capability, or increasingly will have the capability, to make those decisions and reactions on their own. They'll have consumed enough data that they don't need to be told in advance what to do in a particular situation.
So as ChatGPT was released, people started asking the CEOs of Google and Microsoft and Salesforce, what does this mean? And many of them are on record saying that the release of large language models in this new world of generative AI is the greatest technology leap since the invention of the internet. Would you agree with that perspective, or do you think that's a little overblown?
I'm not sure that these chatbots in particular are that, but I do think that AI overall is that. But I would also understand why people are skeptical when they hear that. And I think that is why a few people sort of tune out or let it wash over them, because we heard this about the metaverse. We heard this about crypto. And I do think AI is qualitatively different because it is very much about real-world impacts. Even if it is machines creating the impacts, it's not about living in some fantasy universe or sort of conducting a transaction so that no one else can see how that's happened. This is going to impact kind of every industry and every walk of life. And it was kind of interesting when people put their hand up and there was only 2 saying, oh, I used AI more than a year ago. I know that's what people thought was the real answer, but that's not true because there are more than 2 of you in this room that had Siri or Alexa, for example. And that's a primitive form of AI, but it is an example of AI. And another reason why I think it's different is you're here interviewing me. And if this was another type of technology, the CEO of a given company would be much less engaged. And this is the first technology where I've seen the boardroom and the CEOs really just like be on it, sort of within a few weeks of a particular advance or product release, in this case, ChatGPT. And that was a real gut punch for a lot of people, particularly people in leadership roles in organizations, because they suddenly went like, oh, this could come for my job. Oh, this is going to change my industry. And then once you have this sort of input and leadership from the very top tier of an organization, investment and a lot of other action happens a lot quicker. And that's what we've seen this year.
And when you look at that, of having the potential to change every piece of an organization or touch every organization out there, what does that look like in practice with AI?
There's a real range of impacts, I would say. So the sort of ones that we are seeing now for a lot of people, they are seeing the ways that AI could be an improvement to their productivity. And for some people, that is helping them brainstorm ideas. For others, that is literally helping them produce copy for marketing or advertising quicker. For people who do software engineering, it's helping them code at a much quicker rate. We haven't yet seen too many of the examples of where people are thinking of entirely new ways to do their jobs, or they're imagining an entire new jobs and how AI could do it, but I think that's where we will end up. AI is getting infused into a lot of places outside of white-collar workplaces as well. So you have a lot of AI-powered robotics now, and that is going to change the way manufacturing occurs in America, and it's going to make the economics of manufacturing very different. So jobs that had been outsourced over the last 30 years, those functions, if not every one of those jobs, will start coming back into places like America that have a really strong supply of chips, that have really strong sort of workforce talent supply. So I think it's going to change fields like that. And then, there are some really exciting use cases as well. So, I know people are often worried, oh, is my job going to go? I think it's more likely that a lot of functions within your job are going to change, and a lot of them could be done better with AI, or where you're working with the AI. Some things you won't do anymore because AI will be able to do them, but that will free your time up to do other things. And then there are whole fields, in particular in medicine and healthcare, where I think about our aging population and the relatively slow pace of drug discovery and things like that. And you think about, we don't have enough people to provide the mental health support that the population of this country needs. We don't have literally enough doctors and nurses to care for our aging population. There are thousands of conditions that don't have treatments or effective treatments right now. And through AI, we're going to be able to do things like discover drugs a lot quicker. We're going to be able to find new uses for existing drugs. We're going to be able to screen for different conditions in a quicker way, whether that is the AI being better at finding cancer and tumor images than humans are, whether that is the AI being able to detect how sort of mentally sort of unwell or unstable you are through listening to you when you call up a doctor's surgery or a hospital and being able to triage you into the right direction. There's so many fantastic use cases for it. But there's also a bunch of problems, which we might get to.
Oh, we're coming there. Figured start on a positive note. And then as you think about, we've got a room full of public affairs professionals who are maybe interested in using more AI in their work, learning more about what it can do to benefit them. What advice would you have outside of reading your newsletter of how to get smart, how to incorporate it in the day job of a Washington policy professional?
I mean, I would keep it simple. Just experimenting with it is probably the best idea. And you may have rules in your organizations like we do that effectively limit that. So I am not allowed to use an AI chatbot to help write my articles, for example. But I was giving a talk in Chicago a couple of weeks ago. I didn't think I was the absolute expert on that part of AI. So I 100% used ChatGPT to kind of like check myself and was like, okay, I want to give 5 examples of where AI is being used in conflicts. What are the 5 examples you came up with, ChatGPT? So I definitely have used it in that sort of brainstorming phase. And I don't think I'm that good at using it. But what I've sort of learned, and it's hard to explain, but the point is to go and test it for yourself, is when you play around with it a little bit, you learn what are the sort of prompts that get you better material. You learn that sometimes you don't get a good answer the first time round, but if you go back and ask it again and again, you end up with better, sort of more useful material over time. And so I think the golden rule there is we don't know what the next great product is going to be, but the more familiar you are with the various products, the quicker you'll be able to leap on whatever that thing is that is actually amazing for your job, or that you do need to learn in order to keep your job and not get sort of replaced in some way. So, today is better than next week or next year to start discovering.
Mm-hmm. And I think when you say prompts, one of the best practices that I heard is you can actually put it in what your job is, and it will get smarter in the answer it gives you. Mm-hmm. So you could say, I'm working at an NGO trying to influence Congress, or I'm a reporter trying to give a speech on X issue, and ChatGPT will try and become you in some ways in the answer that it gives. And I've heard very good things from people who've used that.
Yep. And actually that speaks to a trend that I think is really important as well, is don't get too hung up on ChatGPT or Google Bard as somehow the end point of what AI is. I think what a lot of organizations are going through now is realizing that they would have a lot of liability if they just simply plugged in a really general product like those 2 products into their organization. So if you work in a regulated industry, for example, you can't be right 89% of the time. Like, your customers are relying on you, or you're going to have legal problems if you're wrong 11% of the time. So a lot of organizations are trying to figure out how to structure their data and apply the kind of thinking and the models behind ChatGPT, but have them work just within the constrained data of your organization, for example. And so I think we're going to start to see a lot more what I sort of call small language models instead of large language models, which will be seen as more trustworthy because, if you are trying to do medical support, you want that to be trained on sort of peer-reviewed medical papers and scientifically proven stuff. You don't want it to be trained on whatever junk ChatGPT found on the open internet. And so we're going to see sort of a refinement and evolution of those sorts of products, and that will be more useful to you in your jobs over time. And I can't tell you exactly when it's going to happen, but that's definitely the trend line.
So can we talk a little bit about how large language models, whether it be Google Bard or ChatGPT, are learning from the information that this room might put into it? And another way to ask that, do you have guidelines about what information is okay to put in, what information you shouldn't put into one of these large language models? And then behind the scenes, is it taking that info and putting the info in the model itself?
Yeah, I mean, it depends from product to product, and a couple of companies have been caught out because people were just going in and they were doing exactly what I just told you to do. They were experimenting, but with commercially confidential information. And so if you are Samsung and you're doing that, and then one of Samsung's competitors is asking very similar questions, and suddenly you're getting all Samsung's recent data pop up on your screen, that's not great if you're Samsung. That's actually a real example. And I think when a couple of them started coming out, that is what led a lot of organizations, including our own, to say, like, no, you can't use this on the work laptop, et cetera. And so some real restrictions got put in place. So I think probably the golden rule is don't put any time-sensitive, commercially sensitive information into it if you want to make sure it doesn't leave the building. But if you're keeping it general, it's probably going to be fine. And more of these companies have sort of clarified exactly what they are and aren't doing with your data. And it's trending in the direction of being more respectful of your data. But the bottom line is we still have a regulatory vacuum. As nice and as interesting as this sort of executive order is that's coming out right now, that doesn't protect all of your data. We don't have a federal privacy law. So you should be conscious of that before you start uploading lots and lots of material.
So that's an excellent segue. It's a little bit of a wild west out there of companies essentially self-regulating themselves and what they're doing. Major news today with this executive order. Tell us, what is it and what does it do?
Yep. The ground foundation is we don't have any legislation. And so the White House has been very worried on a number of fronts. And that's why they've put out a fairly extensive executive order today. And they have been motivated by several things there. So I'll give you the context, and then I'll give you the content of it. The motivation is they know that China has been working on developing rules for the last 6 years on AI, and they came out with their first set of regulations in end of May, I think it was. The EU has almost finalized a comprehensive piece of legislation called the EU AI Act. And the US was, I wouldn't say caught flat-footed, because the US is doing what the US does best. It was innovating, and the companies have been engaged in a pretty intense debate about how to be responsible in their own practices. But certainly Congress was caught flat-footed by ChatGPT's arrival. And then the White House in particular has been worried about all the ways you could misuse a tool that powerful. And they've been a bit afraid to talk about it, so that's why you don't sort of see lots of headlines about this. They're less worried about, oh, the robot overlords are going to control us. They're more worried about problems around synthetic biology, for example. If you were to use the power of these generative AI tools to create new chemical compounds, i.e. bombs, or pathogens. Like you can't create a virus with ChatGPT, but the process of discovering new dangerous viruses and then your ability to recreate that in a lab is sped up a lot by these tools. And so the White House has been very worried about examples like that. And so what they've done in this executive order today is put a bunch of requirements on companies that have the most powerful AI models. And that's going to require a little bit of government inspectors being able to see under the hood of those models. There is a lot of self-reporting from the companies to the government. It's not clear exactly how that's going to work and how much we can trust that. But the point is it's a fairly extensive set of requirements on the companies. Within federal government, each agency is going to have to create a chief AI officer. And then there's going to be a lot of, not restrictions, but standards around federal government procurement of AI. And because the government, is often the largest buyer of a lot of things, that is going to help shape the market for everybody else to sort of behave in a safer way. And it's not going to replace the need for some legislation in Congress. And we know from past areas like environmental regulation and so on, there's undoubtedly going to be some kind of Supreme Court challenge to some of this order. And the Supreme Court might knock some of it out for going too far. But I would characterize it as a fairly aggressive executive order, and pretty much roughly what I would have, if you put me and made me president for a day, I would have done something roughly like what they did here. And it doesn't go as far as what the EU and China were doing, because I think what they're trying to do is like put down a serious marker, but learn from some of the missteps of the EU and China. Because the problem is when you go first, you go first. No one did it before, so you do the best you can. And the EU has even learned in its drafting process that it's made some mistakes. And so, hopefully the White House has learned from them, and Congress will then learn from what isn't working in the first few months of the executive order, and then come in with some rules, in my opinion, in 2025. I don't think they're going to get it done in 2024. But, we've got some basic temporary guardrails in place until then.
So taking the application of the new EO, how broad is it, and how would folks in this room know if their company, organization, or association might need to report on what they're doing if they're building their own maybe small language model?
For now, I think, a lot of companies are, I suppose, tech companies in a way today. But unless you're really one of those sort of top 10 tech companies or OpenAI that did ChatGPT, you're probably not building one of the most powerful models. But that could change over time, because when Meta released their biggest model, kind of, in theory, it was an accident. And someone accidentally leaked it, but I'm not sure that it was an accident. I think they wanted to do their version of Google creating the Android competition to the Apple App Store and iPhone. I think that's what Meta was doing when this model somehow got out there. The point is now you have something nearly as good as ChatGPT that anyone can go and fine-tune and build and create their own model out of. So if one of your companies is deciding to do that, that might put you in the White House firing line. But for now, I think it's more the case that your chief technical officers or your chief data officers are going to be watching and learning from how these companies apply the order. They're going to wait to see, because everyone's going through this the first time, they might be copying and pasting the procurement guidelines of a given federal agency, for example. And that wouldn't be a bad thing to do because everyone is doing this for the first time. It helps to learn from others.
Yeah. I'll say one of the interesting trends we've seen is we started to see a couple of clients building their own small language models built off of either Google Bard or OpenAI or the Meta one to be able to centralize their own information. And so that would be one of these interesting questions of, all right, if you're building that, does that have to report? And what does that then mean? So a good item to follow up on as more of the details come out. But Ryan, would love your help. What's the scope of possible different regulatory pieces? The EO is only a start, but where else there could be more significant regulation? What would Congress do? And on the most extreme of people saying you should go all the way to be this conservative to obviously no regulation, what does that menu of options look like?
Yeah, I think probably the two biggest branches of regulation that would take it beyond the executive order are some kind of licensing regime or some kind of set of banned users. And so by licensing regime, that shouldn't sound scary. At the moment, like a hairdryer has more safety testing and warnings than AI does. And given what AI might do to our democracy in the future, that's probably not the right balance of things. And a plane, you don't put a plane up in the air and then see if it lands 89% of the time and then tell everyone that was a great outcome. So, we have a lot of examples of doing proper testing and accreditation and making sure things work before they're out there in the wild or being used by you and your family. So I don't think it's sort of problematic per se to say that we might have licensing regimes for AI models. It's probably impractical to try and license every example of AI, though. So I imagine what Congress is going to end up doing, and this is sort of what the EU has decided to do, is to look at are there particular cases that have to be approved of, or not cases, products that have to be approved before they are sent out there into the world. Or, for example, if they're ones of particular national security concern or because they are very strategically important, maybe that is something that shouldn't be run by a private company or has to be done in collaboration with the government. And the really extreme example there is this idea of artificial general intelligence. Like if we ever do get to the point, I don't know if it's 5 or 50 years down the line, but if there is ever the idea that a massive network of machines would one day be smarter than all of us and be able to operate without any of our input and could potentially somehow control us, I mean, I can't believe there's a world where the US government doesn't seize that from whichever company bought it and says, now we're in charge. We wouldn't just let Elon Musk develop nuclear bombs. Like, he does a lot of interesting and dramatic things, but if Elon Musk was out there producing nuclear weapons, we wouldn't allow that to happen. And artificial general intelligence is in that sort of category. So that is kind of an extreme endpoint of licensing. And then there's the whole situation where maybe we just say some things are just too dangerous. We just ban the idea of work in particular types of synthetic biology. Like, it's not, like, whatever might come out of it is not worth another pandemic. So, okay, we say this is not allowed. And the EU does create the possibility for that in their EU AI Act. I don't imagine that they're going to actually apply that possibility, but what they have is a risk-based framework. And so they've basically created 4 categories, and they're going to treat your AI sort of with a different level of seriousness and scrutiny according to which of the 4 categories your AI model falls into. And then China does have licensing already, and that's because they're essentially afraid that big tech companies could get too powerful, or people might get access to too much information if ChatGPT were just thrust onto the Chinese people. So there is a version of ChatGPT in China now, or a rival. It's not from the same company. And that came out 5 or 6 months later because the Chinese government did go under the hood and they wanted to know exactly what answers were going to come back when people started using it. So that is proof that you can have a licensing system, but it's also an example of where the intent matters. So if you're doing licensing to make sure people don't create bombs, that's very different to sort of doing licensing to stop them from hearing about sort of a protest or what happened in Tiananmen Square.
Okay. Great segue. I want to talk a little bit more about the EU. So I think one of the things we saw, and you were based there as a reporter, is when all the discussion around GDPR started, that was a policy idea around privacy that started in the EU. And I think many people in the US had a little bit of a view of, oh, privacy protections. What's this? Why do we care? Suddenly the EU did it, and then California did it, and we as the broader US found ourselves reacting to that of should we have global privacy standards and should that be legislating. And so in many ways, the EU led the US in that effort. Are we going to see the same thing here with AI, where the EU is going to just get regulations faster and we're going to find the US regulations and policy following what the EU's done? How does that dynamic work?
A bit. Yeah, it is a bit like that. I was in the room when that got proposed, the EU privacy regulation, and I remember thinking, oh my God, this is crazy. And a better version came out the end of the pipeline, but I was definitely on the more, free market isn't the right way to think about it, but I was, the people that proposed the EU privacy framework were very much, the state knows best people. And my part of the EU wasn't on that line of thinking. So we fought for years to change exactly what the final product was. And that itself is a relevant lesson, which is that nothing happens quickly in the EU. So that process began in 2012. The law wasn't finished until 2018. AI is moving at a quicker pace. But it's an example of why you have to get in early and start thinking about these things. Because if you sit there and wait and wait and wait, you really will struggle to catch up, let's say. And I think it's really interesting to watch the dynamic between Brussels and California. There's often a lot of sort of, I don't want to say dialogue, they're not copying each other, but they're watching each other. And they're learning from each other. And so anything that happens in Brussels or California will spread to other parts of the world. And because, California is a center of tech innovation and the EU has turned itself into a center of tech regulation, it doesn't force Washington to follow, but Washington has to react, even if it doesn't have to follow, let's say. So I think that the EU will get there first, but they'll probably be a bit too rigid in how they're doing it. So there is a kind of second or third mover advantage to the US being a bit slower. And I watch what Chuck Schumer is doing in the Senate, and I think that's quite clever, because I think they realize they really messed up over social media sort of over the last 10 years. They didn't understand it, they didn't take it seriously, they watched it blow up bits of American democracy, and they realize they look really dumb in some of those hearings. And they're determined not to be like that with AI, which is a really positive thing. But at the same time, Chuck Schumer doesn't have 60 votes to do anything. So that's why he's buying time with this Insight series. And if you've followed any of these forums that he's been hosting, and he's going to host 9 in total, and the next ones are on Wednesday, part of that is really about a genuine effort to make the senators smarter about what they might end up legislating on, and to distract from the fact that they can't get a piece of legislation through now, which is what they might have liked to have done 6 months ago.
Fascinating. So I want to come to Schumer in just a sec, but before we leave the EU thought, how long has the EU been thinking about AI regulations? Just the last year, or has it been a longer process? And then when do you think they would actually enact something?
Yeah, it's been about 2.5 years, I would say. And one really interesting thing there is how useful the privacy regulation has been for doing the AI regulation. Because when you think about all the amount of data that an AI system is going to consume, to figure out how to regulate that without having a privacy baseline is actually annoying and difficult. You kind of basically would have to shove a privacy bill into an AI bill if you didn't already have a privacy bill. So Congress has made life harder for itself now. Like, everyone's saying all the right things about AI, but because they didn't act on privacy, they're just making their own work harder and slower. So the EU's been working at this for about 2.5 years. They, because they were a bit prescriptive about what they thought the types of AI are or were and what the problems are or were, they were just caught flat-footed by the arrival of ChatGPT, and it just wasn't in the law, and it was basically finished when it came out, and then they had to go into a whole new round of negotiation. And where we're at now is the EU has a lot of institutions, and it's a bit like House and Senate having to reconcile their draft bills in the US. There are just more institutions in Europe. All of those institutions have now come up with their versions of the bill, and now they're in the process of basically integrating the texts. And that probably will be finished in the next month or so. But then the way the EU works, and it didn't solve all of their Brexit problems, but one of the ways of making people feel more comfortable about sort of rules being imposed from Brussels is you negotiate these central texts in Brussels, but then you require the national parliaments to figure out how they want to implement it and what agency they would create, or what, all the different sort of granular details. And that takes another 18 months. So when you read some headline in a month saying the EU has got their EU AI Act, know that that isn't going to mean anything until the middle of 2025. And so the EU is then going to be like, what's our version of the executive order? We need a Band-Aid to put on this system for the next 2 years. So even if they look like they're ahead of the US, they've got their own problems, so don't stress out too much about it.
This is a very useful perspective. Final EU question, quick tangent. If folks in this room are looking to try and influence what's happening in the EU and track what's going on there, it's so different than the US system, so far away in terms of time zones. What would you recommend?
That is a tricky one. One dynamic that is important to know is that most of the money and most of the power is still in the national capitals. So the EU, even when the EU looks rickety and slow, there's more of a logic to it than it looks like on the outside. Like any sane economist would say the euro currency is constructed badly and it's full of holes and da-da-da. But it's honestly never going to fall apart because there are too many political reasons for everyone to keep it stuck together. And that's true in a bunch of other things now as well, including on tech regulation. Like the EU, it's easy for the EU to regulate tech because they have less to lose, because they have less of the big companies. And sometimes that looks like, oh, they're targeting American companies. They're honestly not targeting American companies, but they're just so determined to have some kind of human rights-based approach to technology. And they've realized how good they've gotten at creating these systems and then exporting them, that they kind of like, they all just stick together to figure out a way to do that. And then some of the collateral damage is American companies, but it's not designed to hurt American companies, let's say. So I would keep an eye on the big national capitals, which is Berlin and Paris, and the UK is on the outside, but the UK still has to do a lot of things the same way as the EU. So keep an eye on London. They have long-term budget planning processes. So I think the thing is to kind of be scanning the edge of the horizon, because stuff that doesn't seem to matter now, all of a sudden it builds up, and then they've locked in a 7-year budget for it, and then it's too late for you to influence it at that point. So I think sort of getting in on the ground level of different EU debates, even if they feel far removed from what is going on in the US, is important, because it's hard to get 27 countries to do anything, and once they've got them lined up, they're not going to undo it because you suddenly realized at the last minute that there was a problem with what they were doing. So you've got to get in early in an EU process, I would say.
Fascinating. So bringing it back to the US, you made a great point that the EU is having maybe a little bit of easier time because they already have a privacy legislation to be able to build upon. Is it safe to assume that any sort of AI legislation that passed through Congress is going to have a very significant privacy component? And is it almost as if those two efforts are going to get merged together and be one and the same, or not really?
I wouldn't confidently predict that, but it's definitely a possible scenario. And probably what we're likely to see is a couple of itty-bitty bits of legislation first. So, politicians have a keen sense of self-interest. I think they're keenly aware of how the AI can disrupt their own careers and the election process next year. So I wouldn't be surprised if you saw some very targeted piece of legislation around requiring disclosure about using AI in election campaign ads, for example. I can imagine that can get 80 votes in the Senate tomorrow if someone wrote a 4-page bill on that. But what I can't imagine is a comprehensive piece of legislation, including because they have to figure out things like the privacy piece, and because the Republicans have not been the most organized in the House recently, and the Democrats control the Senate. So if one party controlled both houses, that would make it much more likely that you would have seen action in this year or 2024. And because that isn't the case, I think we need to assume it's probably going to take a little bit longer.
I want to spend a little bit of time talking about possible election impacts, but I think at the core is this technology of deepfakes that gives the ability to give an impression of any leader or individual talking as if it was themselves, and just ask everyone in the room, think about what if the leader of your organization was seen and she or he was sharing something through a deepfake that was totally false, but could have a very negative detriment to your organization. Very real challenge many of the members of the Congress and people running for office face. What's the best way to protect against that without regulation in this world that we live in?
Yeah, the only answer is a pretty terrible answer, which is that we all need to have a certain level of AI literacy. We all need to have a certain skepticism. So some of that involves, you need to see some of these deep fakes to kind of realize how good they are, to believe it yourself, that you need to be a bit skeptical. And then, I hate to say it, but I think we're heading towards a world where you kind of can't trust a lot of information, at least not at first sight. So you've got to check who else is saying this. Is there a second reputable source that has made this claim? And then there's inevitably going to be examples where even the smart people who are supposedly the ethical, clever ones with all the resources don't do that skepticism themselves. And my prediction is, it might not even be political. I can easily imagine a scenario where, I don't know, the head of S&P or some other credit rating agency, is said to have announced that the US has downgraded its credit, or Ukraine is now a junk bond or something like that level rating. And that causes the market to move, and then the stock market has to close for a while because it turns out that was totally fake. And then we all have to learn the lesson the hard way through an example like that. Politics is another example. Donald Trump was a very creative campaigner. I can't believe that people working for Donald Trump aren't thinking about ways to use AI in similarly disruptive ways to the way that he has disrupted the rest of politics. So, and he's not the only one, because it is an arms race, so all sides in the election are going to be thinking about ways to do this. And then there are less dramatic examples, but will just be super annoying, because AI can generate so much content so quickly, and it can be very targeted towards you as an individual now. I just think we're all going to get a bunch of annoying crap next year that we don't want to read. And then we're all going to have to figure out ways to tune it out, but then somehow find the one thing that we're supposed to pay attention to. And that's going to be very difficult.
Well, I'd say the other side of this is the impact it's going to have on policymakers, where they just create so much more content than ever previous before, that they're going to be in a similar position of trying to navigate all these different custom thoughts, letters, policy position papers, and trying to find the signal from the noise and how to understand really, hey, here's what I should be focused on.
Yeah. I mean, if there was anything that I wish AI would do for me, I'd just be like, can you please summarize all my emails in one bullet point per email, and then I'll read them.
Well, fascinating conversation. We're going to open up here for questions after just one more that I've got. But obviously, things are changing so quickly. What's the best way to stay on top of this? Obviously, your newsletter is a great source for that. But where else would you recommend that has trusted information if you're not trying to read that much but need to stay on the cutting edge?
That is difficult. I think for me personally, I created a Twitter, now X, list where I just tried to collect anyone where I saw them say something smart about AI. I sort of added them into a list, and then I refer back to that list. But that would be a very self-serving answer. Read my newsletter and follow my Twitter list. But it's public. You can. If you went on my profile, you could look up my AI and quantum computing list. Who else is very smart about it? The Verge is a very good outlet. I read a lot of what they do. They're very good. Trying to think who else. Other people do it in a fairly light way, so it's not consistent. That's what's tricky. One thing I will say is there are a bunch of shonky AI newsletters out there, and I signed up to all of them because I hadn't been an AI reporter before, and I was really worried about looking like an idiot when I started the job. So I was like, well, I've got to sign up to everything. And one thing I did notice is that it's a lot of people just aggregating other people's content. They're not doing their own original thinking and reporting. And then they have these very clickbaity headlines. And you have to open it to make sure you're not missing out on something. And then you realize it's something from 4 days ago, and the headline doesn't really match the content. So I think have a read of an example of an AI newsletter before you actually subscribe to it would be my advice, because there's a lot of them that are a waste of time.
That's great advice. And I've found similar to you, Twitter ends up being a great source of just culminating, but you've got to find the right folks on it.
Yeah.
And it is changing so quickly. There's new information coming out every week. Well, incredibly impressive that this is a new beat you've taken up. You've become a significant expert, and I've learned a number of things in this conversation.
Thank you, Alex.
So really appreciate it. Would love to open it up here to the audience. I'm sure there's questions in the room. So anyone want to get started? We've got one all the way in the back there. Mary Kate.
I'm good at being loud. So Mary Kate Cunningham, American Society of Association Execs, thank you. I've learned way more in this than like half of the AI presentation, so thank you. Question, you talked about security concerns for companies and people that are scared to use this. I've heard that through the paid accounts for generative AI, that it's safer and it's a closed loop, but I've also heard practitioners say, don't believe it. Even some of the experts don't know how this works. You don't want to put your proprietary information. What do you think?
Yeah, I think caution is better. Like it's better to be safe than sorry. And there are ways that you can kind of mask it, in the sense if you took your company name out and just deleted the 7 times that appeared in the text, it would be a lot harder for someone else to figure out it was a reference to your company once you feed it in. So I think there's ways to do it, but I just think be cautious would be my advice.
A question in the back.
Hi, I work a lot with like grassroots advocacy campaigns, and I'm trying to find ways to explain to them how they can use AI to, advance their legislative efforts. I've told them about stuff like, you can use ChatGPT to track bills, summarize bills, and kind of adjust legislative asks for different politicians. And I'm just wondering if you have any other advice.
Yeah, I think I use Google Bard quite a bit as well, and that can connect into your... So this relies on you trusting that Google is treating all your data in the right way, but they do make the promise that they're not training the model on this information. But you can connect it to your Google Drive, for example, and it's quite easy to get it to summarize documents there. I think the brainstorming is probably the best thing, like to get you through that hump of a blank page, or to get the meeting started. That's probably the best use for people in a campaign situation that I can think of. And then I guess if you have sort of, if you need to send out that information into 13 states, you could ask it to tweak a message for those 13 states or for those 6 different age groups, whatever it is that you're trying to break it down, instead of you having to go through that first thought process. If you're giving it the strategic framework, it can do a bit of that grunt work easier. And then, you're going to do like the tweaking of the text afterwards, and you should. Like, don't assume what it did was great. Like, you got to check it. But then that's the thing where you might save 20% or 40% of your time if you sort of like put in that strategic thought at the beginning and then get it to do some of the tactical stuff.
Well, and I'll share one of the things we're working on with the Quorum technology is to have AI generate a different grassroots advocacy message for every advocate that emails Congress. And so you can take your first one and maybe you put in ChatGPT, have it generate 10 versions that you all like. And then in the software behind the scenes, will go and generate 1,000 different versions of that message. So it seems like every advocate created it individually. And then to Ryan's point, you can review it on the back end and say, hey, these are the ones I want to send, or these are the ones I don't want to send. But that's what's coming as we think about how AI can help influence policymakers, is much more variety of content, much more personalized content. And I do think the large language models are going to get accurate enough that you'll be able to go and say, hey, here's all this information I know about this legislator. What's the best way that I can come pitch this legislator? And I think the Google Drive tip is an awesome one of connecting with BART, because you think about, you can put in Google Drive all the policy position papers, all the information from their campaign, their floor statements, et cetera, and suddenly you get a very helpful series of suggestions.
And you could get, I don't know if this is really wacky or creative, but a lot of the the effort in that sort of campaign is going into thinking about what the content is. But in the same way that you don't want to send the same text to the legislators because it's just like delete, it's all the same crap. Something like a handwritten letter counts a lot more than an email. So if the AI was generating the text and then all you had to do was spend time writing out that text, like that's a way to maybe get more engagement and get your content standing out, because you haven't spent all your time developing the content. You've spent a bit more time on the form and making it stand out in how you present it.
Well, and I would just say, I think it was an excellent segue to thinking about your advocacy strategy of where is it going in 2, 3, 4 years. And so in the world in which there's so many different variety of messages, it goes back to this trusted source of it's going to be the people that know the member of Congress, the member seen in their district, who can deliver that handwritten letter or come and see them in person, and a little more probably on the grass top side. And so certainly something worth thinking about. I think the other piece, like the video too, of hey, I really do believe this person has been sitting here saying this given thing. But I think it's just a reminder of just how quickly the world is shifting.
Yeah. Oh, and actually the video is a really good example. So it's not, I don't think it's a deep fake when it's intended, but there are services now. One of them is called HeyGen, Heygen, and you can feed 2 minutes of yourself talking, and then it can make anything you want in 140 languages using that video that you fed of yourself. So you've got to create the text you want to be put into your mouth, but you don't need to speak Spanish or, I'm trying to think now, Norwegian, to get a message across to that audience. It will copy your style of speaking, your pace. It's really quite incredible. And that's why it will be scary if someone is deepfaking the president, sort of declaring war or something like that. But for good purposes and for reaching people you otherwise wouldn't be able to reach, like you now have a lot of very interesting options.
I'll also share, I've heard a story about that same technology being used to imitate a CFO and having a CFO call their finance team and say, hey, I need these dollars wired here, or I need you to go pay this invoice, and leading it to fraud. So would encourage you, as you think about the risk part of your jobs, to go talk to your finance team about what verifications they're putting in place, because it is getting scarily good.
Yeah.
We had another question over here.
Hi, Lisa Henry, American Hospital Association. Our members are very active in development of small language AI right now in the healthcare space. And one of the things that we're hearing a lot about is the risk of bias in a lot of the language created. What do you think that'll come up at all in regulation, or is this going to be something we have to develop ourselves?
Yeah, I think that's an example where California is probably going to be doing really interesting stuff. And I should have mentioned that earlier. So California is doing a lot of investigating. Like Gavin Newsom has basically told everyone to go out and do their homework over the next 3 to 6 months, and then deliver some very concrete reports back that can then be turned into real action in California. And that has been a concern of the White House as well. So like if there is a single golden rule about AI that everyone should remember, it's that if you put in biased or incomplete data, like if you put in crap, you're going to get crap back out. Like the AI is only as good as what it can be fed. And so that means it's really important to think hard about how representative the data is. And there are ways to reverse engineer it sometimes. So for example, if you think about a lot of advertising or marketing, like it hasn't always been the most representative of different populations. It doesn't mean you have to go out and now take 1 million photos of diverse populations in order to train the AI to do it. You can generate AI images of what people of all different shapes and sizes and colors look like, and you can feed that into the AI in order to make sure it is then giving more appropriate responses to whatever the challenge or question might be. And in medicine in particular, like that's where it becomes super important, because if everything is just developed in Silicon Valley, then you're stuck with whatever Silicon Valley is. And whole countries are left out, whole different racial or ethnic populations could be left out. It's a 77% male field working in a lot of these technologies. That is not good enough for the 51% of the world that are women. So we've really got to, and the problem is, because all of this advances so fast, if you don't sort of correct for this at the beginning, like, you sometimes don't know what the problems are. And then if the problems are getting exponentially bigger, but you don't even know where they are or where they started, like it's too late. That's why people have to get this right at this point in the process.
We've got time for one more question, right over here.
Hi, Brianna Osteen from Amazon. I was thinking, as today we're seeing the fact sheet come out and we're just kind of in the early stages of regulation, when do you think will be that we'll see healthy appetite to use AI in bill writing or the policy making process more broadly?
I think it's probably already happening at a very low level. And another example, it's not just in sort of legislative or executive, it's also judicial. Like there's a lot of legal examples here where law firms have been using AI for quite a while and they'll keep using it. I do think judges will start using it. And so I think the most important thing is that this is the transparency aspect of it. I don't think any of it is necessarily bad, but people need to sort of know when it is appropriate or allowed to use AI or when it's being used at them. Like I think when it's sort of happening behind closed doors and you don't know who or why or how, that's when it becomes a problem. But I think we have to get used to the idea that it's not going to go away. Like there's never going to be a situation where we're just going to be able to like ban it and put it away in boxes. Maybe in the nuclear sort of chemical weapons categories, yes, but not in the bill writing process and so on. So I think, like, I'm sure it's going to get integrated more and more into your products. And I think, in a company as large as Amazon, like you have the full tech stack already with sort of what you sell to others. So I think you'd almost be crazy not to try and think of ways to use it internally. So I think it's kind of here, and it'll definitely get here in a bigger way pretty soon.
Well, and on that note, Ryan, thank you so much for taking time to join us, especially on this news day. We'll give you a big round of applause. All right. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be back in 10 minutes. 10 minutes. And we've got a great panel hall tonight focused on Congress. So please join us for the last event of the day and enjoy the refreshments. And thanks again.